Hello everyone, this is Tom. Today I'm going to talk about the incredible William Gibson book, The Peripheral, a novel. It's just one of the most beautiful, inventive and satisfying science fiction novel I've ever read. If you don't know William Gibson, he's the author who coined the term cyberspace in the 80s, and he's also one of the pioneers of the cyberpunk genre. I've always found that the main trait of really great science fiction is that it's a literature of ideas. If you take Arthur C. Clarke, Heinlein, Asimov, Silverberg, they were all masters because they peppered each page of their short stories or novels with a myriad of really original ideas to make your mind explode. And William Gibson does exactly the same on this book, on every page. And this is why, in his own words, his writing process is painstakingly slow. As for the reading process, you need to take it really slow with this book, at least at the beginning. Otherwise, there's no way you're going to be able to capture all the little details and inventions that Gibson stuffed it with. It's a 500 pages book that took me personally the time to read it that I usually take to read a 750 pages book, but it was entirely worth it. As typical of his classic stories, with the Peripheral, you are thrown right in the middle of the action and you have to figure out what the characters are up to from context. That is including some strange new technologies and odd new terms. It's always a kind of a thrill that you can learn to swim this way. The approach is frustrating sometimes, and many find it frustrating, but it seems to be also how Gibson inspires a motivation to get engaged in the problem solving that is at the core of his plotting. And this is also how he likes to read his books, with a little bit of a puzzle or problem solving mind, as he said in an interview. So the first 30 or 40 pages of this book are going to take you probably a couple of minutes each before you get acclimatized to its language and make out what the heck is going on. By the time you're properly drawn into the plot, you'll be burning a page or two a minute, and then some fresh development will slow you up again, etc., etc. But I personally spent at least 3 minutes only on the very first sentence of the book, which is the following. It's they didn't think Flint's brother had PTSD, but that sometimes the haptics glitched him. So it took me a little bit before I actually understood. By the end of the next page, we had unexplained mentions of these pickers, hefty mart, look 4 and 5, and other odd terms that are completely made up. One note, if you Google the Peripheral book glossary, you will even find a limited glossary of terms that a helpful and slightly crazy reader uploaded to help you follow the book. The Peripheral book glossary on Google. So in this book there are 2 futures to be deciphered. The future that's containing this hefty mart, which is around 2030, in 10 years from now. And then there is, in this future in 2030, we are in a small town in the US where everything is more or less like it is now. There are some wounded veterans. The only real money in this economy comes from building drugs, like pharmaceuticals. Homeland security is the main power in this land, and most of what you need is either bought at Hefty Mart or it gets fabricated by a 3D printer manufacturing factory. And also playing video games is, for lots of people, a proper job. The other world is in the future, and it's in a desolate London, much farther out in the future, around 2100, so in 80 years from now, after an apocalyptic event known as the jackpot that has wiped out 80% of the world population. The streets are deserted, there are androids amusing tourists, but really there are not a lot of people walking around London. And this is a world much darker, and where the technology that Gibson invented for this world is far from and beyond our comprehension. This is a great way for Gibson to lend the book to two types of science fiction. One that is very realistic, based on today's technology, plausible, and one that, yes, it's plausible, but it's so far away in the future that he concedes himself a lot of licenses. In any case, I don't want to spoil any of the plot because it's a complex one. There is a publicity stunt that goes wrong, all hell breaks loose, and the two worlds are linked, the 2030 and 2100, because the later world contains a black market technology that's popular among hobbyists that allows people to reach into the past, to reach digitally though. And so paradox is avoided because at the moment they make contact, the past splits off. It ceases to lead up to the present and becomes a stub, like a branch or a fork in the timeline. The world is a branch, and it does never overlap with the other realities, or in a way that other time travel stories, like for example Back to the Future, would have done. But I can try to summarize the plot like this. After testing what she thinks is a new video game, the protagonist Flynn, she witnesses a murder. She wasn't playing a really drone piloting simulation game. She was piloting a real drone in this divergent future. This happens in the very first pages, so no worries, it's really not a spoiler. William Gibson is always dissed for his sketchy characters that don't lend really themselves to much of emotional engagement by his readers. For others, though, that same kind of cool detachment of the characters is the right stuff in noir traditions that makes them heroic Davids against the corporate Goliaths. His characters, I think, are created with only a few strokes, and they have select revelations of emotions, but it feels pretty masterly the way he creates them. They are really human with their quirks, ambitions, etc. And often it's hard to find out who's a lead character in Gibson stories, because there's an omniscient observer who's hopping among all the different perspectives of 10 or so characters. There are many, many beautiful moments in the book, some of them really full of inventiveness, some of them even very poetic. For example, on page 403 of the US paperback, this one, there's a moment where Wilf from 2100 is visiting 2030 through the limited capabilities of a kid's toy called a Wheelie Boy, which is basically a stick with a screen and a camera on wheels. And at a certain moment he's left by himself, wandering through a house that to his eyes looks really ancient. And to me that was such an extraordinary and moving scene. There's also on the internet somebody who created a Wheelie Boy 3D reconstruction. I'm gonna put the link of this reconstruction below because it deserves to be at least checked out. It's a very creative visualization of this idea. Finally, let me add that at the end of the review from The Guardian that I read from The Guardian, there is a couple of notes that I tend to agree with. The Guardian says, Gibson is such a polished and propulsive writer that you nearly won't notice that the plot is sort of a mess, that he's peopled the novel with too many characters sketchily delineated. The strength of The Peripheral is that its technology is not weightless. Yes, its weakness is that too often its characters and its situations are, but my goodness, what a glorious ride. Again, this is a thing of beauty that once you get through the first 30, 40 pages, you will realize the genius and the incredible work and intelligence that went into crafting this work. And I would recommend this book not only to people who love science fiction, but to anybody, and especially to people who want to have a taste of what science fiction used to be in the golden age of science fiction. Thanks for watching. Please add your comments below. I would love to hear your opinions about this book if you read it, and any other thoughts. Thanks a lot.